All right, ladies and gentlemen. So the Nintendo Switch 2 has launched to massive success. There is no denying this. Everybody knows this. The Nintendo Switch 2 console has done very well in its opening sales. But there's one thing that not a lot of people are talking about, and that has to do with Nintendo Switch 2 and their attempt at becoming a third-party supplier through their console. Now, everybody knows Nintendo for their first-party games. Everybody knows that Nintendo consoles sell because of the first-party games. But Nintendo never really cared too much about third-party. They were always well behind Sony and Xbox when it came to third-party, and they still are, even with the Nintendo Switch 2. However, the Nintendo Switch 2 is a lot more powerful, obviously, and has allowed them to have much more third-party games as Nintendo starts to make a push towards third-party to try to compete with Sony, because everybody feels like Xbox is pretty much out of the race at this point when it comes to hardware. They're more of a publisher. They focus more on Game Pass and all of that. Nintendo, however, unfortunately, is finding out that they're not really sought after when it comes to third-party titles, because even though the console is selling well and the first-party titles are selling well, everything else is selling like complete and utter garbage. So let's get into the article, guys. But of course, before we do, special shout out to the 90,400 of you that are subscribed to the channel and the 50% of you that are not subscribed. If you enjoy the content, consider hitting that subscribe to help me get to 100,000. All right, boys, let's get into it. So the Nintendo Switch 2 is a huge upgrade. We already know that. More power, more speed, more all of that. However, according to a recent report, Nintendo's greater commitment to the Switch 2 third-party titles might not be paying off yet. Now, I wonder what's going to happen with the third-party titles from Nintendo, because here's the thing. These games, especially the games that are on the Nintendo Switch 2 right now, these are games that are, number one, have been out for a while already, right? Like Cyberpunk, for example. They've been out for a while. These games have been offered for heavy discounted sales many times before on many different platforms already. And now it's available for a nice little chunk of change on the Nintendo Switch 2. I gotta wonder if people are ever going to see the value in paying nearly full price for these games on the platform that's the weakest out of every other platform that's available to play those games on. I just tend to wonder. This is why I don't know if Nintendo is really meant for third party. Of course, they can offer it. It's, you know, it's always good to have a little bit of variety when it comes to your lineup. But I don't think anybody's ever going to look at Nintendo console and be like, yep, that's my third party system. That's the system I want to use, unless they have no choice, right? If that's all they can afford, and that's perfectly fine. If that's all you can afford, then you just make do with what you got. And I respect that. That's nothing wrong with that. But if you have the option to explore outward and people have the option to have that choice, then if you have that choice, I don't see people picking Nintendo. That's just me personally, at least for third party, especially when they won't put the games on sale very often. And if they do, it's nowhere near as good of a sale as when it's on, let's say, like Steam, for example, or even PlayStation, right? Like PlayStation Store offers a lot of sales. There's no reason for me to think people will pick Nintendo. But in any case, Mario Kart World obviously is dominating on Switch 2 because that's really their only game right now. It's also hard not to see Donkey Kong Bonanza continuing the early momentum and success. These games have one thing in common. They're first-party releases, and it's a different story for third-party games from what reports say. And like I said before, everybody's going to go buy Nintendo Switch 2 to get the first-party games. You're not buying a Switch 2 to get the third-party games. If you can only afford that $180 game or whatever from Nintendo, then you're going to buy Mario. You're going to buy Donkey Kong. You're not going to buy Cyberpunk as your only game to play on Nintendo Switch. That just doesn't happen. I don't see many people doing that. The Switch 2's vastly upgraded specs, and I don't really think it's vastly, but whatever. Vastly upgraded specs mean the device is well equipped for bigger third-party games. According to the games business, most third-party Switch 2 games posted very low numbers. One third-party publisher characterized the numbers as below our lowest estimates, despite strong hardware sales. So they really ate up the Kool-Aid. They really ate it up, and they told themselves that, oh, wow, the console's selling this much. That means we have the ability to sell potentially this many games. No, bro. No, if you are a third-party publisher on the Nintendo Switch 2, you are going to have the lowest amount of sales you could possibly have for your game compared to other places that you could release the game on, right? If you released it everywhere, then that's fine. But if you're a third-party publisher only releasing on the Switch 2, you are basically just destroying your game's opportunity at that point. So the data show that there has been more attention to third-party games early on, but these figures are skewed due to certain factors. The Switch 1 only launched with 5 physical games, which was The Legend of Zelda Breath of Wild, 1 to 2, Just Dance 2017, Skylanders Imaginators, and Super Bomberman. By comparison, the Switch 2 had a wider selection with 13 physical games available at the launch of the system. It's believed the lack of reviews at launch created a sense of discomfort and distrust toward third-party media on the Switch 2, likely putting consumers off. No, it's because people know already. People know already that you are not going to get a pretty decent third-party experience for the majority of high graphic fidelity games on the Switch 2. You're always going to get the subpar experience. It's unfortunate, but it's true, right? If you want the better experience, then you need to use the other consoles that are way more powerful. Or if you have a PC, well, you use the PC. But Nintendo Switch, it's just there because it could be, not because it's the best place to play the game. The game business continues. One of the drawbacks for the third-party publishers is the fact that Switch 2 is backwards compatible with some older games, including popular titles like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, receiving technical improvements on the new hardware. In other words, even if Switch 2 owners are looking at other games to play post Mario Kart, they have other options available beyond the slate of the third-party titles available on the Switch 2. You also have to consider that many of these Switch 2 ports have already been out for several years, which is what I said. Right? A lot of these games that have been released on the Switch 2 have been out for years now. They've been available for years. So whoever is buying it on the Switch 2 is buying it because chances are the Switch is the only console they have. And they never had the option to buy it prior. And they saw it and they were like, oh, gee, let me try it, right? But again, that's few and far between. The numbers don't lie. Many people have already played them, lessening the urge to buy them. Newer third-party titles will likely perform a lot better. I don't know if I agree with that. It depends on what the game is, right? I think we're going to see the capability of the Nintendo Switch 2's third-party by looking at how well the upcoming From Software game actually sells. If that game, Duskblood or whatever it's called, from Software, if that game sells very well as a third-party title on the Nintendo Switch 2, then they're going to be able to actually provide some decent competition. But if it doesn't and it bombs and the game has to wait until it releases on other platforms to be successful, then that's going to tell you everything you need to know about Nintendo Switch 2 and their capability as a third-party platform. This is just them trying to get into it. I understand they're trying to get their feet wet. I get it. Apparently, Cyberpunk is the best-selling third-party game available on the Nintendo Switch 2, but that's not saying much. That's not saying much at all, unfortunately. It's just it's the best of the worst, if that makes sense. So you could celebrate that, I guess, if you want, but nobody's really celebrating the fact that it's the best of the worst. That's just being real with you. So you guys can let me know ultimately what you think in the comments down below. Do you think Nintendo Switch 2 has a chance to be a third-party competitor, seriously? Or is it something that's kind of like a gimmick at this point? Because everybody kind of goes to Nintendo for their first-party titles. We know this already. It's been like this for decades. And only now that they feel like Xbox is kind of bowed out of the console race, only now are they starting to now try to compete. Plus, you got to keep in mind, Nintendo has notoriously been the weaker systems, right? While the other systems have been pushing graphical fidelity, Nintendo has just been pushing the simple, control their marketplace. They have a very specific pie that they have of the market share. Their section of the pie has been held down by them for decades, and they're never letting it go, right? They never should, to be honest with you. That would be stupid, but they're never letting it go. They're trying to expand outwards now because they feel like they can, because the Switch 2 finally caught up to the PS4, which the PS4 was able to handle some decently graphical games, depending on the settings and whatnot. But we're about to enter the PS6 and the next Xbox generation. We're about to enter there within the next couple of years at this point. I know it's crazy to think about, but that's where we're about to enter. And the Switch 2 is going to be out for much longer than that. So the Switch 2 is going to have PS4 style graphics competing against the PlayStation 6 and whatever the new Xbox is. Needless to say, I don't really think this is going to end up very well. So you guys can let me know in the comments. What do you think ultimately? Do you think the Switch is going to be a third-party competitor, or should they just stick to what they do best, which is their first-party, titles, and that's what they have control over their fan base of? You can let me know in the comments down below. And special shout out again to the 90,400 of you that are subscribed. And if you're not subscribed and you enjoy the video, consider hitting that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.